Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Mel ELD check-in for this month. I hope y'all are safe. I know there's storms brewing all across the state here and there, so feel free to jump off if you need to. You want to stay safe. And remember to sign in on the note taker. That link is in the chat. And remember that if you can't stay on, you can watch the recording at a later date too. And if you do watch the recording, make sure you sign your name on that too. I was just looking through that today and noticed that quite a few people actually take advantage of the video, which is great. All right. So we're going to talk about the topic of pre-referrals and kind of planning for how to support multilingual learners that may be struggling and what those struggles might mean, what they might look like, what they might mean, and how do we know? All right, I'm trying to just see me. I'm getting kind of confused. Okay, so my name is Rhonda. I am one of the instructional specialists. I'm based in Springfield, so my regions are in the Southwest region. And again, just remember that instructional specialists are there for you guys. So please feel free to communicate with us anytime if you have small questions or big questions, or if you just want to, run something past us, we're available for you all. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this from different perspectives as we're considering how to think about students who are struggling and how to proceed with those concerns. So we're going to talk about identification. What does that look like? How does culture play into the way that we learn and the way that we teach? Examining data, what kind of data, and how should we look at different pieces of data? Who needs to be on the pre-referral team, and what assessments might look like. I also have a couple slides that have several links on them for you to explore later. So you can get the links on that note taker page, or the slides on the note taker page. All right, so this presentation is not something I just made up or something that I thought, might work. It's actually following DESE guidance. So this flow chart is on the ELD webpage. And basically, this is a rundown or a summary of what we're going to talk about today. So that first question is the student struggling, having difficulty in school setting? So then you follow that chart. And this is something great to share with your SPED team and with your classroom teachers because there may be some considerations on here that they haven't thought about. Sometimes we don't think about, checking your eyes or your health background first because we're so used to kids coming with a full medical record. But for our multilingual learners or our newcomers, sometimes they don't have that. So all of what I'm going to talk about today is gleaned from or based on this flow chart. So feel free to click on that when you have time and get one for yourself. All right, so take a look at this cartoon. This is one of my favorites. So this is kind of what we ask of students when they come to us, right? We have a standard and we want them all to get there. So notice who's smiling in this image. It's obviously going to be the monkey because the monkey says, climb a tree. I got that. I can do it. Everyone else is like, how in the world is that going to happen for me? And this is sometimes how we feel teaching, like, oh my gosh, how do I get this student to this standard? So when we're thinking about how to help students academically is when we start thinking, what do they know? What do they not know? How do I know if it's an issue or just a language difference? Okay, so I would like to ask a question, and you can put your answer in the chat. What percentage of students in the general population in the United States are identified for SPED services? So we're looking for a percentage. How many do you think are annually identified for SPED services? 8%, 15%, 12%. Okay, good guesses. All right. So as of 22-23, in the US, about 15% of the general population was identified for SPED services. And in Missouri, about 14%. So about the same, right? So the idea of commensurate uh, determination of SPED services is that the same percentage that would be present in a general population will most likely be present in an EL population or a multilingual learner population. So the guidance then is the proportion of multilingual learners identified as eligible for SPED services should be the same or should be roughly the same, should be commensurate with the proportion of general population students identified as eligible for SPED. So if you're keeping records of that in your building or in your district, you're going to want to say, do these numbers look pretty much the same in my general population and my ML population? And if they're above or below, why? What could that be? Okay, so that's two different kinds of identification. There is sometimes an underrepresentation and sometimes an overrepresentation of multilingual learners in SPED services. So if there's underrepresentation, there are fewer students identified for SPED services in your ML population. Here may be some reasons. Maybe there are similar characteristics in the identified students in the second language acquisition and disability, and educators may attribute all of that to just second language acquisition and just say, well, that's a multilingual learner, so it must just be language acquisition. And sometimes schools place informal policies about referrals to SPED for newcomers. For example, the myth that MLs cannot be served within SPED programs, so they must choose one. That could lead to underrepresentation of MLs in your SPED program. And there's also the myth that MLs must wait 2 years for referral to services. And that is also not true. So those are things that could lead to underrepresentation of multilingual learners in your SPED program. And then sometimes there's an overrepresentation of multilingual learners in your SPED program or receiving SPED services. And that could be because educators are not familiar with second language acquisition. So SPED is kind of used as a dumping ground or the place where all the kids who need special services go. Maybe multilingual learners are assessed with invalid assessments that are not culturally and or linguistically relevant to them. So that could lead to overrepresentation. So again, that's a way to just monitor your own numbers in your district or your building is, are they proportional to your general population? Okay, so just a little bit about second language acquisition. My guess is that most participants here today are pretty familiar with this process. But I just wanted to bring out a couple different things that we have to consider when we notice struggles for multilingual learners. So the picture on the left with the L1 and the mom and the baby is typically the way that we learn our first language. It's very encouraging, it's very nurturing, it's low affective filter, it's kind, and any efforts or any attempts on the child's part are greatly rewarded, right? It's a safe environment. In the L2, which is English in our case, it can be very time restricted, demanding, it can be embarrassing, it can be, students can feel shame and can be called out for things they don't understand. So we have to just remember that our brains learn best when they are not stressed, when they have low stress. So when we see students who are not doing well or who maybe are withdrawing and not performing, we want to take some time to just address the stress level, maybe in a classroom, or the stress that they've even put on themselves about learning. Okay, so that's another factor that could show as a difficulty that may be language related. Okay, so I think we're familiar with the stages of learning acquisition, right? From silent or receptive, right? I always think about that as babies who are just listening and learning, to early production, where we're talking in words and phrases. Speech emergence would be those kind of level 3 students who can produce simple sentences, but they're still making some errors. Intermediates would be about the fours. They can work mostly independently, but they're still making some of those basic errors. And then level five, where students are approaching proficiency or nearing native language proficiency, native speaker proficiency. And so this is how this relates to our WIDA levels. So here are a few key features to think about. The reason we need to know about second language acquisition, of course, affects how we teach. But in this case, when we are dealing typically with a team of other educators who may not know a lot about second language acquisition, it is incumbent on us, the ELD staff, to be able to explain it in a way they understand. So we have to understand it well, right? So we want to explain to our peers, our colleagues, the importance of home language literacy. That is the number one factor for transitioning to a second language, transitioning to English in this case, okay, is the level, the fluency of literacy in the home language. So that's something we want to identify is how literate are they in their home language, and then we want to talk about that with other teachers. The understanding that there is going to be a silent period, that students are going to come in, and even if they do have some English, they may spend some time just trying to figure out the environment, right? The radar is on and they're trying to figure out how to operate in this environment. There are stages, as we saw in that previous slide, but stages don't necessarily, all the domains don't necessarily all shoot up at the same time, right? Stages may develop differently across domains. So a student may, like we say, sometimes they may learn social language really quickly, but they're still lagging behind in reading. So just that awareness that there are stages, but there's a difference in development across the domains. And the domains, reading, writing, listening, speaking. Language transfer. So positive and negative. For a really good analysis of this, I encourage you to listen to a video by Dr. Elsa Cardenas Hagen. She is a bilingual speech language pathologist, and she does such a good job of comparing how Spanish positively impacts the language transfer to English, and then also some ways that it negatively transfers. So, for example, in Spanish, if you see a T, it's T in English, it's T in Spanish, that's a positive transfer. But if you see a J, right, in Spanish, you'll say it a H, and in English, you'll say a J, and so that's a negative transfer, right? But those things can just be taught explicitly. We just have to be aware that there is a transfer sometimes. Every time, all the time. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, sometimes it's neutral. Social language versus academic language, I touched on that. Students, especially your outgoing students, your very talkative students, will probably learn social language pretty quickly. It doesn't mean that they're going to be able to read and write at that same speed. And then other students who may be more introverted may prefer reading and writing and lag behind a little bit in speaking because of their personalities. Receptive and expressive. So students tend to gain receptive language, that's hearing and reading before, listening and reading before speaking and writing. So speaking and writing would be expressive, and that typically takes a little bit longer in a second language. And then just the reminder, everyone take a breath because time to fluency varies, right? I love this image. Everyone's growth looks different. It does need an apostrophe, whoever did that cute little image. I know all of us English people are like, needs an apostrophe. Okay, so the second thing we're going to talk about is culture. So in this image, we have a symbol there. And depending on where you're standing, it can look like two different things, right? The person on the right says it's a 6. The person on the left says it's a 9. Someone else says that looks like a G to me. So where we stand and what our experiences determines how we interpret things. So that's evidence of how culture or how background knowledge or prior knowledge impacts how we interpret everything we see. This is happening all the time. We are constantly interpreting new stimulus, right? So that's why a bell can ring at school, and some people would say, "Yay!" and some people would say, "Ah, we're good under the table." Like everything that we see, we interpret through our own lens. And where this comes from is mental maps. So from the time we are in utero, from the time we are little beans, we are learning norms. We're learning the things that are safe, and we're becoming familiar with our surroundings. So this is a quote from Dr. Stephen Covey. Hopefully you've read The Seven Habits. It's an excellent book. We interpret everything we experience through mental maps, also called paradigms or culture. We seldom question their accuracy. We're usually even unaware that we have them. We simply assume that the way we see things is the way they really are or the way they should be. It's the way we see the world, not in terms of our visual sense of sight, but in terms of perceiving, understanding, and interpreting. So we do this as teachers. We do this as students. So we may notice something in a student and say, "Oh, that doesn't seem normal to me," or "that seems outside of my experience," because it's a natural way that we live in this world is with mental maps. So we're just always trying to question, what am I seeing? Is this normal in the context? Is this something I can learn about or be curious about? Okay. So as we're gathering data or noticing things about students, we always have to say, is that my own experience? Can I see it in a different way? All right. So there is the phenomenon that culture is the big bubble. We all live within the norms of our culture or our paradigms or our mental maps. So, culture being the behaviors, values, ideas shared by a particular group of people. So, it's the concept of things, right? If you say dog, I have a picture of a dog. That's my culture, that's my concept. Um, but cognition is the process, it's my mental process. And so it helps me to interpret everything I see, right? And that's related to my culture. They cannot be separated. Cognition lives within the culture. So here's some examples. All right. So for a student who grew up in Springfield, Missouri, or in this area, this means probably Christmas time, right? It means cold, it means wet. We have a visceral knowledge of snow and snowmen and the season. But if I grew up in the Congo, this is something so foreign, I don't even know how to think about it. I don't know what it smells like or feels like, or I don't know. I don't know how to dress for it. It's a completely different culture. And so my cognition about it, my perception of it, it is completely different from someone who knows about snow. I always talk about cows because we are in the Midwest, and I didn't grow up around cows at all. But there are some students who literally cows are part of their religious culture. And so the way that our students who grew up on a farm think of a cow and the way that a Hindu student might think of a cow varies greatly. So an answer on a test about a cow between a Hindu student and a Springfield student may vary, right? So again, culture impacts cognition. And then that kind of speaks for itself. So we've all had varied experiences with law enforcement, and that could impact how a student perceives that in school. Okay, so just one more quote about culture and cognition. I have some links there as the image because, as Collier says, cultural identity and cognitive development occur concurrently and are enmeshed with one another. Both describe perceptions and the manner in which we develop awareness and interpret our environment. This is to us. Any effort to assess or provide intervention with cognitive development must be done within the cultural context. So, we can't gather accurate and appropriate data on a student without thinking about their cultural context. This is why we spend so much time gathering data from families, talking to parents, looking at previous school records. We need to know something about that child's cultural context in order to even come to conclusions about their cognitive development. Okay, third thing is data. So data can be tricky. What data do we gather? Who's responsible for what? How long do we gather it? All of that. Now, some of that is going to have to be determined by policies that your district puts together. So there's not necessarily one answer for everybody. But gathering data is a non-negotiable, right? We don't make decisions based on our gut or just because, well, I think that child is different or learning differently. We have to have data that supports it. So I love this quote by Dr. Dyer, who says, when we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. So this is what's interesting about data and statistics and charts and polls. If you have five people looking at a piece of data, you can have five different interpretations, right? So, how are we interpreting the data that we see, and what lens are we looking through? So, anytime that we're looking at student work, we need to be thinking broadly about the lenses that we're looking through. Okay, so here's another question for the chat. What data points would you collect or do you collect if you have a concern about an ML's achievement? So just think about a couple pieces of data that you collect when you have a concern about one of your students' academic situation. A family interview, yes. Yes, language growth over time. From WE to scores, probably. Intervention data. Yes, NWEA. Yes, some standardized tests, program monitoring, progress monitoring, family education. Daily observations. That is data. Yes. Yes, previous education. Oh, pre and post tests are good. Yes. Okay, so there are so many points of data we can gather. To list them all, well, you can find lists probably. You can find lists anywhere, but you really need to obviously um, edit it to your particular child and your particular situation. Okay, so here are just some things that we should be aware of as we're looking at data that can sometimes cause confusion for educators as they are looking at student work. So there are just some language, some orthography differences, some writing differences. So if we have students who come to us with the Roman alphabet and with some literacy, some reading and writing, they're going to make those transfers fairly easily, right? They write the same letters. They read and write from left to right. Got it. They're the monkey in the scenario of climbing the tree. But some languages that are character alphabets, for example, look very, very different from the Roman alphabet. And so that's going to take time to specifically teach, and there may be some errors as they're writing. When we consider the Arabic alphabet, which can include Farsi and Pashto and other Dari, some smaller ones like that. So students are having to switch their whole mindset to read a different direction, which is such a discipline for the brain. So again, taking extra time if students from those languages tend to be struggling with the basics of writing and reading. And even numbers, which we wish were universal, but they really aren't. So for example, switching the commas and the points is very common in countries where the languages come from the European Union, so not English history languages, not countries where they were colonized by Britain. And so literally the comma and the period are flipped. So a math teacher might notice that the student is really struggling in math, and we might be able to say, oh, let me give you some insight about this. They do vary in different orthographies of math. Also, just handwritten numbers can look really different. Here's an example of the United States versus Latin America. Chinese numbers. So I just wanted to point out that like the number one looks like a minus. It is one stroke, but it's a different direction. So that can be confusing for a student and a teacher. Arabic numbers, for example, the number five is a circle. That can also be something that needs to be, you need to have some patience with and teach explicitly. And then again, in Arabic, math calculations are also written right to left. So for students taking math, there's going to have to be that consciousness to write the other way, and that may take some extra time. So in addition, as we're looking at student work and maybe noticing some difference, we have to ask ourselves, what language acquisition strategies and scaffolds are really actually regularly being implemented in the students' classrooms? So we might have a student and we've been watching them, monitoring them for their first semester with us, and we're noticing that they're struggling. Well, yes, we consider their language background. Yes, we consider their family and school history. But what's actually happening in classrooms? Are they getting support in classrooms, or are they not? Because we can't call something a problem if teachers are not addressing those in the classroom. So back to that fun image before, we have to think not only are we asking are scaffolds in place, but we also are asking are these appropriate and adequate scaffolds for what this student needs? So the monkey doesn't need a lot of scaffolding, but I'm not going to use stairs for my seal, right? Or for my goldfish. I'm not going to use the same scaffolds for every student. It has to be customized. So what is actually happening in your classrooms if there are students who are struggling? So here are just some guidelines for gathering data about what you notice. So you want to use multiple sources of data to assess all areas of concern. And these can be formal and informal. You all mentioned these in the chats. There was an NWEA, there was some pre and post tests, but there's also classroom observations. Observing the student in the lunchroom versus the classroom. What are you noticing about their speech differences, right? So we can certainly use standardized assessments and nonverbal measures, right? When we're watching observations. We certainly want to do parent and teacher interviews. We want to look at their data over time, so progress monitoring. We want to compare with peers, as close peers as we can, and performance samples, which could just be, write some sentences about your family. It can be something super simple like that as you're getting to know a student. So those are just examples of some data that we can gather. So here is something to keep in mind. The following factors are considered exclusionary, meaning they cannot be counted. They may not be considered the primary source of any noticeable performance deficit. So if a student is really struggling because they're extremely homesick or they're separated from family or their culture is so different that it's taking a while to get used to it here, that's a stage of acculturation. We can't consider that a cognitive difficulty or deficit. Obviously, second language acquisition is exclusionary, cannot be considered a noticeable performance deficit. Socioeconomic and experiential background, maybe they don't have a computer at school, and so it's kind of slowing them down. And they don't have a computer at home, and it's slowing them down at school. And inappropriate instruction. What, again, are the strategies being used at school? Okay, so here's some considerations. Look at their physical health first. As we mentioned before, a lot of times our multilingual learners are coming to us without a medical history. Some may never have been to a doctor or haven't gone much because it's expensive, there isn't one available, they're afraid for their immigration status. There are lots of reasons why people don't get regular health checkups. So definitely check vision, hearing, nutrition. What is happening at home? Is there enough food? Is there healthy food? Is that something we can help provide or offer? Sleep habits. We have a lot of times, parents are working late shifts or the child has to get up early for an early shift. So we want to possibly ask the student or the parents about sleep habits. And then food and environmental allergies is actually a real thing. If your stomach hurts or you can't breathe because you have allergies and you're all stopped up, that can impact your learning. So those are just some physical considerations that we might look at if a student seems to be struggling and we're trying to figure out why. The comparison of true peers. The key consideration in distinguishing between a difference and a disorder is whether the child's performance differs significantly from peers with similar experiences. So, as we're aware, a Spanish speaker who may be coming to us from Puerto Rico may be very different from a Spanish speaker coming to us from Guatemala, right? So, it's not enough sometimes to just look at the language background. We want to look at two students who are as close in background as possible. So, close in age, close in background, close in country too, and regionally, geographically. Okay, so let's look at some students' behaviors and how they can be interpreted in different ways. So here's a student's behavior that may be associated with a disability. Difficulty with phonological awareness. You show them those letters, and every time they just don't seem to be able to recognize them. So then you ask yourself, is the difficulty distinguishing between sounds or phonological awareness an issue in English only or in both languages? So something that indicates that it is a language difference is if they have difficulty distinguishing between sounds that are not present in their first language. Okay, so if there's not an aspirated P sound in my L1, I might always say buh. I might say it voiced every time because I'm not used to that aspirated P. But that is not a disability. That is a difference in language. Okay. So confusion with sound symbol correspondent. Correspondence may be a disability, but confusion with sound symbol correspondence that differs from the L1, like we said, a J in Spanish might always say a sound, and that's confusing initially, but that's just because it's different in the L1. Difficulty remembering sight words may be an indication of a disability, but difficulty remembering sight words when the meaning is not understood, well, clearly that could be a difference in language. Poor auditory memory could be a disability, but auditory memory that's better in the L1 than in English is a sign of language difference. Difficulty concentrating may be the sign of a disability. It could also be that the child is just exhausted and has difficulty concentrating because they need a break. And then I love this last line. Appears easily frustrated could be a sign of a disability, but guess what? It's also a sign of just a tired kid who has been trying to operate in the L2 all day long. And it could be a sign of the teacher who's also exhausted. So I think that's just an interesting way to look at it because remember, disabilities need to be present in the L1 also. Okay, language disability can only be said to exist within the L1, which is their home language. If the language problem occurs only within English or their L2, it's not a disability, it's a difference. It's still a significant issue to address. Obviously, we don't ignore it just because it's in the home language only or in English only. And we still address it with interventions for language development, language acquisition, and acculturation. But if there's a true linguistic disability, it may be identified as an L1 problem also, or that it occurs within the L1 also. It may be manifested within the L2 or English, and it may impact English learning, but identifying it as a disability depends upon identifying it within the L1 context. That to me is such excellent guidance. Okay. Now it does mean that we have to do some exploring about their L1, right? We have to figure out if it's a problem in the L1, and that can be tricky. but it's something that cannot be skipped when we're trying to make this determination. So, how do we know? What is the student's literacy in the L1? If it's a Spanish speaker, there's lots of ways to find out. There are lots of bilingual resources in Spanish. If they are a Kenya-Rwanda speaker, then we go, okay, how do we do that? So, parents, we interview parents about the student's literacy and school history. Now, if the parents are not literate, my guess is the student is probably not literate either unless they went to school. And then in that case, you would say, what was the language of school instruction? It may not be the home language. I grew up in Haiti. Everyone speaks Creole, but the lucky ones that went to school learned in French. So they did not learn to read and write Creole. Most Haitian kids do not read and write Creole. They might read and write French, but they don't read and write Creole because that was not the language of instruction. So in that case, then you're just going to ask parents, do you have materials in Kenya-Rwanda? Do you read and write Kenya-Rwanda? And if the student is literate, ask them the language that they're literate, and that's the language you're going to make connections to for transfers to English. You can also use generative AI to create L1 assessments. I think we've probably all experimented with this now. You can certainly do it on your own with a ChatGPT or a Claude or a Gemini. But I also think School AI, Magic School AI, can probably do it for you as well. So you can translate questions into other languages to see if students can read the questions. You can change reading levels to see if they're able to read in a lower level. You can create quizzes using WIDA score level text. So you would put in, please adjust this text according to WIDA level 1.2, whatever. And then you can translate simple stories into the L1 to observe a student reading in their L1 and see if they can answer questions that way. And my guess is if you need somewhere to start, you could go on to generative AI and say, how can I figure out a student's literacy in their home language? And it will give you some steps too. Okay, this is another resource from the ELD webpage that just contrasts some explanations for behaviors between stages of language acquisition and a disability. So on the left column, you'll see here's the behavior that I'm observing that maybe is a concern. In the middle, what could be a possible ELL explanation or language acquisition explanation. And on the third column, what's a possible disability explanation. So there's a couple of these on the website. Feel free to look through them. I'm just going to do one example. So if a student is very literal, they miss inferences, subtleties, nuances, jokes, innuendos. It's possible that the student just doesn't have enough L2 or even enough cultural background to understand abstract concepts yet, right? I feel pretty fluent in Spanish, but there are some like jokes and some terms that I totally miss because I don't have all the cultural knowledge, having not grown up with that. And then, of course, it could be a disability if there are abstract reasoning difficulties in their L1 or comprehension difficulties in the L1. Okay, I'm going to keep going here. All right, next we're going to talk about your pre-referral team. So ELD people, I know I keep hearing this in districts, are not always included on the pre-referral team, and that boils my bubbles. So that you should always be part of the pre-referral team. And yes, hopefully that is part of your district policies. But if an ML is being considered, being looked at for some possible concerns about learning, the ELD teacher or some staff needs to be on the team. So here's a key question for you to put in the chat. How do classroom and content teachers collaborate with ELD specialists and SPED teachers when there's a concern? What is the process that you have in place? It could be an email. It could be, well, we just talked to each other at lunch. What is the process that you have in place when there is a concern about an EL student? How do you start talking? email, in person. The ELD specialist should have an idea. Casual conversations. Yeah, a care team, sure. Yes. Meet in person, ask details. Yeah, often there's a care team that talks about academics and other things. And so bringing it to your care team or your problem solving team, I've heard of that too, a PST. Okay, so again, it's not prescriptive how that collaboration needs to get started, but there needs to be a way, right? And possibly it needs to be documented when someone has a concern that there has been some start to the process so everybody's on board. So here's some more DESE guidance, ELD guidance. Here's a link to the document. And these are just some of the things that are included in this document. It's very, very good, has lots of good information. Particularly page 16 through 19 is going to talk about a pre-referral team. Okay, so here's responsibilities of the team, and I just enlarge the ones that I really want to point out. So the reason that you have people on a team as you're looking at a student is to have multi-dimensional perspective of the learner, right? You want a cohesive and well-functioning team. You want ELD and SPED departments to participate, as well as general or mainstream teachers. When should these people start communicating? From the initial point of concern, through potential identification, through the IEP process, and the determination of appropriate services, including reclassification. So no one is just dipping in and out. Everyone is working together from the beginning to the reclassification. Okay. And the ELD team, oops. Okay. The ELD person, all members of this team should be trained on culturally and linguistically responsive interventions and services. And who's going to do that on the pre-referral team? It's going to be the ELD staff. The ELD person is going to be the one who knows the most about culturally and linguistically responsive interventions and services. So our role on that team is essential to get an accurate classification. Okay, so here's your team. You may have more people than this. You may have fewer. It depends on your setting. Okay, but for sure the classroom teacher, ELD staff, SPED staff. You may also have a behavior specialist, counselor, depending on what the behaviors are that you're seeing. You may have a nurse, a doctor, a social worker, depending on what the needs are. And it says parent caregiver. This does not mean that the parent or caregiver is on the team, but the information that you have from the parent and caregiver is such an important piece for this team. So I have them on there. So there may be, you can put in the chat if you can think of someone else who you really feel should be on that team. Perhaps administration. You might want your principal or your assistant principal, someone who's kind of responsible for that overall improvement or progress monitoring of students. Okay, so on this team, this is where you say, okay, this is the data that we're bringing with us. We've been observing, we've taken a few pre and post tests, we have this access test, we have the NWEA. Okay, this is what we're bringing with us, but now what? What are we going to do with this? And what additional data are we going to gather? So who collects what amount of time is needed? There should be a protocol. If you can create a digital protocol for these meetings, it streamlines it. So if people can put their data into this digital protocol ahead of time, then when you're together in person or together virtually, if you do an online thing, you're just talking about the data. It's not a lot of it's not a lot of gathering data in the moment. You already have done that, and that way you can just talk about, reflect on the data when you're together. There are lots of templates for that, which I've included in your resources slide too. Okay, so we look at language considerations. What is typical English language development for this language and other like students? What is their proficiency level in the L1? Okay, this is what the ELD teacher brings. That's what the ELD staff knows. What is the parent and caregiver input? What are parents saying about how the student's L1 developed? Was it different from their siblings? Do the parents have any concerns? Were there any medical issues when the child was little? Have there been any hospital stays? Have there been any cognitive concerns? So a lot of times, sometimes the classroom teacher will have this information, but a lot of times it's the ELD staff that will have this information too. And then scaffolds. Let's talk about scaffolds. What is being done in the classroom? How is the student's language development being supported in the classroom? And any tests that we're using as data, have those assessments been normed on ELs? So those are some of the things that we're talking about as a pre-referral team. Now we go from there and we make plans for next steps. What interventions are we going to do? What length of time? Who's collecting the data? When do we get back together? Okay, and here is the ELD staff. I touched on this a little bit, but what ELD staff bring to this pre-referral team are knowledge of the second language acquisition and how that impacts language growth, social and academic history, context. We give context. That bubble cognition within culture, we're giving that context of the home country, their schooling, their language interference patterns, how there's no aspirated P in Arabic, and so it might sound like a B or be written like a B. We're going to relay family background, whether the parents are literate, whether there are books in the home, whether the parents are educated, things like that. We're going to share teaching resources, which could be in the form of us helping the teachers. It can be in the form of a helpful video, a helpful material, etc. We're going to connect parents with interpreters as needed, and we're going to speak up. So we are an important part of that team. And whether we think we should push more for a pre-referral or we feel like we should wait more, we can say those things. We have expertise with English learners, with language learners, and we can speak up for them. Okay, so on this slide, I wanted to give you a couple FAQs that are on the ELD website. I love FAQs because I love bullet points. I like to get to the point. So one thing I love about these resources is they're very direct, they're very succinct. So the first two bullet points give some additional guidance about data that you can bring forward and the pre-referral process, etc. The third bullet is also, it includes a math survey. So sometimes we're really confused about what levels of math students are in. And this one Cami created, I think, is math questions that are number questions only. They have very limited wording, so it's easier to get to what math skills the student actually has. I also wanted to share some additional resources from the IRIS Center. So IRIS Center is out of Vanderbilt University. It has really wonderful resources, mostly for SPED services, but obviously this overlaps and overlays with what we're talking about with multilingual learners. Also, Oregon has a robust process for determining differences versus disabilities, and Minnesota Department of Education. Both of those I've gotten so much good information about, and you know, those states have a lot more English learners than we do, but the templates and the checklists and things like that that we can use and then tweak for our own needs is really, really helpful. Okay, and the last section is about assessments. So we've been talking about data. We've been talking about ways to look at data from cultural lens, from cognition lens, from multi-perspectives. And standardized assessments are tricky because they're not available in all languages and they're not normed a lot of them are not normed on multilingual learners. There are quite a few that are, and I will share those in a couple of slides. But I did just want to give you some basic guidance. So this is IDEA guidance. So again, if you feel like sometimes the SPED and ELD teams are not always seeing things eye to eye, this guidance is IDEA guidance, so it's SPED guidance. Ensure that assessments and evaluation materials are not racially, linguistically, or culturally discriminatory. We can always go back to that and say, let's evaluate the assessment that we're giving. Let's evaluate the evaluation and see if this is appropriate for these students. Assessment and other evaluation materials must be provided and administered in the child's native language or other mode of communication and in the form most likely to yield accurate information on what the child knows and can do academically, developmentally, and functionally, unless it is clearly not feasible to so provide or administer. But don't go to that line too quickly, right? I would say again, with generative AI, there's, I mean, almost anything is possible now with language. Also, no single assessment can be used to determine eligibility. That includes access, right? So if a student has stalled out on access and might have scored 2.0 for the last 3 years, well, that's a red flag. That's something to consider. But we're certainly not going to use that to determine that they have a disability, right? It's that along with all the other pieces of data that we've already talked about. So we want to select appropriate, sorry, I can't see that, evaluations and strategies. Tailor an evaluation plan to the specific cultural, linguistic, and developmental characteristics of that student. So here's one just random example of that on access. So giving the access test. So from grades 3 to 12, it is considered a digital test. It's given online. But if you have students who are brand new, who are newcomers, who are not technically proficient, then you can give that test on paper. That may be a better way to determine what students know. So that's just one example of using an evaluation or an assessment that has one way of being and saying, well, for my students, this other way of checking is going to be more accurate. So you do have some flexibility. Asterisk, if the modifications negatively impact the validity of the score, maybe because you've translated or you've allowed them to use a translator on an assessment, the results cannot be used as a primary source for eligibility determination, but it can still be used as descriptive information. It can still tell you if a student, so if you're giving a math test and they translate the word problem into their language, but then they can do the math, it may not be valid because they did some translation, but you still know they can do the figuring of it. So again, it can't be used as a primary source for eligibility determination, but it can be used for you to say, I think I see something in addition to that. Okay. So you can modify, just be aware it's going to be one piece of data and not a determining piece of data. All right, and this just addresses the don't wait policy myth. There is no waiting period. This is from Missouri FAQs. It was also in the Dear Colleague letter of 2015, which has now been removed from the USED website. However, the Dear Colleague letter was based on court cases that still support that document. And so it's what it said is still valid, even if it's not, even if we can't trace it back. And I did take it off of this slide because it's just not there anymore. But this still stands due to other court cases that support it. So EL students, like other students, are located, identified, and evaluated for special education services in a timely manner. A student suspected of having a disability must not be denied an evaluation, and if eligible, be denied access to special education until she becomes proficient in English. That is not a thing. Okay? All right. So you've gathered data. You've looked at it through multiple lenses. You've taken time to do some interventions. You've reviewed it from multiple perspectives. You've made sure assessments are racially, linguistically, and culturally appropriate. Now you're going to make a decision. You still have a question to ask. So once the referral team has completed the data gathering and the intervention implementation cycle, it must decide whether to proceed with a formal SPED referral or whether the strategies have resolved the ML student's educational difficulties. You want to ask, how will SPED services benefit this child? So this is the three-legged determination, three-legged stool determination. Even if they meet basic eligibility based on an assessment, even if they have adverse educational impact based on whatever, um, and they have some special needs that the SPED services might assist with, you still want to ask, how will being labeled SPED benefit this child? Will it? Are there things that the SPED team will be able to offer this child that they can't get somewhere else? And I just say that because the SPED label is a serious label. We're not out there seeking to get additional classifications for students. We want to make sure that it is going to benefit the child to be classified as SPED and EL. Okay, and then the last few slides I have are just some lists of assessments. So we've got some nonverbals, and then we have some that have been translated. I just wanted to give you access to those. And here are some other kind of programs like iExcel and iReady that also offer other languages, supports in other languages, and then the resources page. So, any questions? All right. Well, Miss Cami, if you're good with it, thank you guys so much for coming. And feel free, if you have questions, reach out to me, reach out to any of your instructional specialists. Again, we're here for you. We've seen a lot of things, so we can help, with talking through some situations.
Thank you, Rhonda. Good information.
Okay.
If there are no questions right now, you can still put them in the note taker later if you think of something. So that's always available. We do go back and look at it. So, and we'll put a recap of today's session on there as well. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you next month.
Thank
Until
you.
then,
Bye-bye.
oh,
Bye.
there's one. Second language acquisition cannot be used as data, but what if it's not improving over years? So it's definitely something that you will look at and you can bring to the team. That's one of those things, collect as much information as you can that you feel is evidence of a need or a disability, perhaps. So again, just collect your data, and that's something that you can use. It cannot be used alone to qualify them, but definitely something you collect.
Right. And when going from L1 character language English, how can we check phonics and reading? Oof, that's hard. One thing I would suggest, or people, okay, is um, trying to find resources from states where there may be more students that have a language background from character. Like I know California would have more resources than we would, for example, here.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I mean,
Starting with oral language is really important. So
mhm.
just using the sounds and talking about them sometimes is helpful, and then making those connections. We also have, you can go to, oh, look up the IPA charts for different languages, and sometimes that gives you an idea of what sounds are present. Even if it's not the same characters, it will give you the sounds, and you can find the character that goes with that sounds and that sound in those charts. So I've found that those are helpful, is just looking up and then listening to the sounds and then finding similars. And there are a lot of charts out there when you look at IPA.
Hmm.
There's some links that we have that if you're interested, I can send you those that where you can find a lot of those charts. We did a presentation not long ago for those.
Hmm.
There is an autism screener in Spanish, but I'm not sure that we have access to that.
Yeah,
Sorry,
for an
my sirens are
official,
going off.
your sirens,
Yeah.
Tammy, you need
So
to go.
I'm watching to make sure the wind's not picking up, so I think I'm good, but
I think you're
you're like,
supposed to
oh,
go.
the siren went on.
Oh my gosh.
Could you please log me out? And for some reason, I don't have the chat or anything on my screen, so I can't leave. I don't have exit, I don't have chat, I do not know how to leave.
I will put some links in on the note taker later on that give you some access to some of those resources that we've come across. So
Yeah,
take a
but I
look
was
back to the note taker.
yeah, but I was asking if there's a way you can kick me out of the meeting because I can't leave the meeting.
Oh, yeah, I can do that. Yeah, let's see.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. Removed. There we go.
Kelly, I was going to say too about languages that are from a different orthography. Um, this is just a personal example, but I took Arabic for a little bit, and yeah, I mean, I couldn't visually make connections between those letters and the sounds I'm familiar with. So I just had to make ch charts
Hmm.
that compare, my A looks like this and my H look like this in Arabic. And it was very, very basic,
Hmm.
but that may just be how you have to go with that student.
Yeah.
Thank you. That makes sense. I have a student that's been here for over 2 years and just not showing any growth and really struggling with phonics and whatnot, but we can't check that in her L1. So that's why I was
Right.
just,
Hmm. Hmm. Are parents saying that the child struggles at home in the L1? What's parent feedback?
um, more or less, no, but the student has only been with parent really for these 2 years. The
Okay.
student was with other family members before, so we don't necessarily have the whole picture.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
Are there any other students who speak the same language that
Yes,
are
and they came,
fluent?
yes, or ish, yes, yes,
So have you made kind of some comparisons between those like peers as far as
yes,
ability? And
yes.
hmm.
And I mean, there's a pretty big discrepancy, but we are we've sorry, I have my own loud children in the background. We've
No worries.
collected some data, but this being kind of my first time, I knew it wasn't going
Yeah,
to be the right data, and now we're starting all over again, and it'll move to August, and I'm just really sad about the lost
yeah,
time. And
yeah.
Hmm.
Well, I would collect some information on those like peers as well then, and how you've noticed that with these students, they're making that transition and those sounds, and even ask, can you help me to understand your language a little bit more with the ones who are more fluent and get some information from them. That's always helpful as well.
Hmm. Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Daisy, I agree. I wouldn't be concerned at this point. I mean, that's kind of a natural transition.
Mhm. That is interesting.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well,
Tammy, I
thank you,
have a
everyone.
question for you.
Go ahead.
Um, so I was given a question. Going through my emails trying to catch up today. Um, I had an admin ask me, can EL students work in groups with students, so with SPED students, even if the EL is not SPED, but the service has been put on their LAP because they don't have a EL teacher. So they have no other way of providing services. But can the EL students work in groups with SPED students? I haven't sat to think about it yet, but I wanted to
Depends
ask you.
on, yeah, it depends on why. I mean, we're not we're not putting them in a special ed class that
Yeah.
is not going to challenge them and promote their language acquisition. If it's not something that's furthering them, but
Well, the question specifically was, do they have to be worked with individually or can they be put in with the groups? Because it has been deemed
yeah,
they need the service to increase their language acquisition.
right.
But there was a question of if they don't qualify for
Yeah.
language services under IDEA, can they be in those groups? Or do they have to be worked with one-on-one or as a separate EL group?
They can be in a group, but they shouldn't be sent to special ed. That's kind of what I was getting. Shouldn't be sending them to special ed class, but they can be in a group that has special ed students in them. Yes.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, it was a specific question about working with the speech language pathologist specifically.
Yeah.
Um, so not part of SPED.
Right.
The students aren't SPED. They're just EL, but there's no other way to give them services.
Yeah,
So
they
they were
can
just
be in small
wondering
groups
about
with any,
logistics.
yeah, they can be in small groups with any group of students. It's
Okay.
like that's kind of like push-in and co-teaching and collaborative classrooms like that. They can be in any small group setting, but we can't send them to special ed for their services and let them get their services that way.
Right. Schools can't think that we're covered
Yeah.
because they're seeing the
Yeah.
SPED teacher.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And like I said, they don't have an EL teacher. So
Yeah.
at the moment, they have nothing else.
It's tough.
Sirens are going off again.
All right, Cami, you should probably go.
Yes. All right, people.
All right. Thank you,
We hope
y'all.
to see you
Good to
next
see you,
time.
Rhea.
Everybody be safe. Good to see
Bye
you and the
bye.
baby. All right. Take care, everyone.